In 1965, Helen Schuckman, a Columbia University psychologist, began hearing an inner voice that claimed to be Jesus. It said, "This is a Course in Miracles. Please take notes." When A Course in Miracles was published in 1976, it went on to become a modern spiritual classic. Helen's notes actually went through several editing processes, and this resulted in extensive wording changes and the removal of about 45,000 words. Helen's original handwritten notes remained hidden for decades, containing tens of thousands of words not in the published work. The material that was taken out turns out to be a goldmine, offering crucial clarification of how to live these teachings. It became clear to us then that a new edition of the Course had to be produced, one that was based on the original notes. So what we have done over a number of years is to carefully transcribe those notes and then edit from scratch a new edition of A Course in Miracles. We have restored in one way or another all the missing material from Helen's notes. We've also restored original wording. For instance, "Prepare you not for the undoing of what never was," which had been changed to "Prepare you now for the undoing of what never was." We've also added footnotes to help the reader. These explain difficult passages or clarify things the Course alludes to. In the appendix, we have 33 cameo essays that feature material that's too personal to the lives of Helen and her colleague Bill Thetford to include in the Course proper. This material is incredibly clarifying as to what it actually looks like to apply these teachings in everyday life. Throughout this new material, one thing becomes especially clear. A miracle is primarily an expression of love. One person expressing love to another. This is very different than what most students have believed. And therefore, this new understanding of what a miracle is means a new picture of what A Course in Miracles is.
Robert, tell me a little bit about your history with the Course.
Well, my history starts with the Course when I was 21. I had heard about the Course and was interested. I was into spiritual things. I was a student of Edgar Cayce. And my friends and my then fiance got together and gave me a copy of the Course for my birthday. And what happened then was a process began of years of getting drawn further and further in. I was very eclectic. I believed very much in many different teachings. I didn't want to have a path. And the Course just over many years drew me in. And it also kind of invaded my life. I got drawn into being very active with Miracle Distribution Center. And I started teaching. I started writing. I started getting invitations to travel and speak. And after a lot of years, I turned around and realized that not only was this my spiritual path, against what I had said before, but it was also my career. And I had been really set on a different career. So that's kind of how my career with the Course as a teacher got started. And then what happened was in the early 90s, I had originally began teaching in the 80s, at Miracle Distribution Center in California. In the 90s, I moved to Arizona and started my own organization with my then wife and some friends. And the point of that organization was to serve Course in Miracles students in really following the Course in their lives, help them understand it better and help them apply it and live it. Originally, we had a much more kind of expansive view of incorporating many viewpoints on the Course. But what happened as the years went on was I realized that everything is there in the book if we are careful in reading it and faithful to what it says. All the clarification that we need is there. And so over time, our focus became what we call Course fidelity, being very carefully faithful to the teachings in the book and to the instructions for how to practice these teachings and how to live them in our lives. And that became our mission, to really have a kind of a scholarly focus on what does this say, and then how do we then translate that into the actual living of it. So that became the Circle's mission.
Tell me a little bit about this course, because a lot of people watching this might be surprised to know that this blue book with which they're familiar is not the only version of the course that's existed. So talk me through the history, the timeline of the course, if you will, Robert.
Okay, there is a very interesting and important history behind the publication of the course. In 1965, Helen Schuckman and Bill Thetford were colleagues at Columbia University, and she began hearing an inner voice. And the voice began by saying, "This is a Course in Miracles, please take notes." And that meant that she was supposed to be recording what the voice said to her. And so the very first version, you could say, of A Course in Miracles was her handwritten notes. And she would write in this mixture of handwriting and shorthand symbols. And then, after writing those down, she would then dictate by voice those notes to her colleague Bill Thetford, and he would type up what she dictated.
Right, so she wrote into notebooks, sat down with Bill, and he transcribed, typed up.
She would dictate to him what she had written, and he would type it up. And so his typescript, which they called the urtext, which means original manuscript, that becomes, in a sense, the second version.
Right, the first version being the handwritten
her
notes.
handwritten notes. Yeah.
Okay, and what happens then?
So one thing that's important here is that while she's dictating to him, she's not necessarily dictating everything she's taken down, and she's sometimes dictating the wording a little bit differently.
Right.
Okay, so the urtext, the typescript, has differences with her notebooks. Okay, and then at a certain point, she went herself and retyped the entire text of the urtext and edited as she went.
Right.
Okay.
She, without Bill, was Bill involved in that
Apparently
too?
without Bill. We don't have
Okay.
what Ken Wapnick, a later collaborator of hers and Bill's, called this the second draft. And the public hasn't seen this, but Ken's claim was that she typed this and she edited as she went.
Right.
Okay. And then she and Bill took the second draft and they edited that and produced what they called the Hugh Lynn version. And that was named after Hugh Lynn Casey, the son of the psychic Edgar Casey.
Right.
They struck up a connection with Hugh Lynn. Hugh Lynn had been very supportive of her channeling, her scribing, as they called it. And so they edited the second draft into the Hugh Lynn version, which they then sent to Hugh Lynn Casey.
Why did they do the Hugh Lynn Casey version?
It just needed some more editing, in their view. It needed cleaning up. Originally, it came out in certain ways that was kind of rough.
Okay.
And so there was editing needed. There was personal material that needed to be taken out or changed. So they then produced the Hugh Lynn version, which has commonly become known as the Hugh Lynn Casey. And then eventually, Ken Wapnick comes on the scene, another psychologist. He becomes privy to this manuscript.
It's still a manuscript. It's not a published book. It's still
It's not
typed
published.
manuscript.
It was a closely guarded secret.
Okay.
They called it their guilty secret.
Right.
They didn't want it to wreck their careers. And Ken Wapnick suggested that it needed more editing.
Right.
And so Bill, according to Ken, just didn't have the patience to go through another editing process. So Helen and Ken then took
Right.
the Hugh Lynn Casey version and produced what became the Foundation for Inner Peace, or FIP, first edition.
Okay. And that was the first, the FIP first edition was the first time the course moved from being a manuscript to a published book that people could buy.
But it was published in 76 formally.
76. So take it from there. What then happened to the course? It's now out in the world as a published book. What happened from that point on?
Well, it became a contemporary spiritual classic.
Is this the book that I have in my hand? Are you describing the FIP book there?
Yeah, Yeah, that's the book that everyone's familiar with.
So everyone's familiar with it, but now you've produced a new version. Tell me about that.
Right. Well, the reasons for that really go back to that process that I just walked you through of, there was the handwritten notes, there was the urtext, there was a second draft, there was the Hugh version, there was the FIP first edition. Most of the course that we've all had for 40 years is what Helen took down. However, there was editing throughout, most of which took place in the first several 4 to 7 chapters of the text. But that editing was extensive. By our count, there are only about 21% of the sentences in the first 4 chapters of the text that retain their original wording. So about a fifth. Also, there were approximately 45,000 words removed. And that's a small book. So my own connection with that removed material really goes back to 1991. In that year, Ken Wapnick published his story of Helen Schucman and the scribing of A Course in Miracles, which was called Absence from Felicity. Before then, so I'd had the course for 10 years. Before then, we'd been told virtually word for word, and yes, there was a little bit of personal material, and there was some material about Freud, and I kind of envisioned that as just a scattered sentence here or there that had been snipped out of the published course, but no one that I knew had seen this material. And so 10 years later, Ken Wapnick publishes Absence from Felicity, and there's thousands of words he includes in there that were part of Helen's original dictation that none of us had seen. And this extra material electrified me. I thought it was so helpful and so fascinating. It really enriched my understanding of the course. And so I was all over it. I was taking notes in my book to the point where I had to have my copy of Absence from Felicity recovered, given a new cover, and I typed in all those words that were not in the published course. And then 9 years later, another big event happened. And that's that someone got a hold of the Hugh Lynn Casey version from the Casey library, and they put it online. And by this point, I had spotted certain places in the course where I thought, that has to be an editing error. Right. And so the very first thing I did when I got a hold of the Hugh Lynn version was I went to one of those spots to see, and this was not the original, this is just the version just prior to the FIP edition, but I wanted to see what it said, and sure enough, it said virtually exactly what I presumed the original must have said.
Right.
So that there was an editing error. So I was amazed. I started reading that version, highlighting places that were extra material that I'd never seen before. And then not long after that, someone had obtained the urtext, which was Bill's typescript. So version number 2, as you put it, and put that on the internet. And when I saw that, I did the same thing. There was a spot that, because the Hugh Lynn Casey version, all we have of that is the text. And there was a spot in the workbook where I thought, this has to be an editing error. And so the first thing I did when I got the urtext was go to that spot. And I was looking for, was there an S on the end of a certain word? Because that S determined whether you were doing 1 longer practice period for a 10-day review or 2 longer practice periods. So it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the S was not there, which is what I expected. And that really fueled my sense that not only was there extra material, but the editing, things had gone wrong in the editing. I didn't know how much.
Okay.
So at this point, I'm really intrigued, feeling like there's a gold mine in this early material. Then what happened, the next big development from my standpoint, was that I wrote an article in 2004 about the earlier versions and the editing of A Course in Miracles. And to prepare for that, I spent months reading this parallel column version where you have the text on the left and the Hewlin Casey version in the middle and the FIP edition on the right. And as I read across those columns, I really understood a lot about what had happened in the editing. And one major thing I noticed was that when something got changed or dropped out, it never made its way back in. And what that said to me was that when they edited, they were only editing, their base text was the latest version. They didn't go back and consult versions before that. They didn't go back and consult the original handwritten notes. And so what was happening was what Americans call a telephone game, where, you know, the editing errors were being compounded as the chain grew. From my standpoint, the more I read the material that got edited out, the more it enriched my understanding of A Course in Miracles.
Right, okay.
And some of it, I think, was absolutely supposed to come out because it was just personal to Helen and Bill. But a lot of it didn't seem personal to them. And a lot of it was very clarifying. And so what I did in that article, just try to track what had happened. I didn't want to malign the FIP edition. I thought it had been very intelligently edited. I just thought it had been edited a bit too much.
Okay.
And so at the end of the article, I said, what I think really needs to happen is a new edit needs to be done that goes back to the original notes and edits with the kind of care that would befit a document that for many people is their scripture.
So you decided absolutely needed to revisit and re-edit the course. Sounds like a big job. How did you do it?
Well, our concept was to start with the handwritten notes, which eventually also kind of came to light. And therefore I'll say that it made sense to start there because that was where Helen was writing down the words she heard.
So that was the
Everything
first...
after that, right, that's the first version. Everything after that, all the changes after that are human editing, or at least we have to assume they are. Maybe she heard extra guidance about, but we don't know that. So it made sense to start at the very beginning with the original inspiration. And that's what people want. That's what any student of a so-called scripture wants. They want the original document. And the first order of business then was to transcribe those notes, which means deciphering Helen's handwriting, which in most cases isn't too hard. In many cases is very hard. It also meant creating a symbol key for her shorthand symbols. She seems to have used about 80 shorthand symbols. Creating the key wasn't too hard because remember, most of this material has been dictated into the urtext. So if you see a symbol there and want to know what that symbol means, you check the urtext.
Okay.
So transcribing the notes was a huge job. There's a lot of, there's the course itself as published was 1,200 pages. There's obviously extra material in there. So we transcribed them. We've had people on our team check that transcription, and we've had that checked with all the checking. I've made sure that all the changes really do fit the notes. So we've gone through a lengthy and fairly careful process of really trying to make sure that we have the actual words that she wrote down. We put a lot of effort into solving unclear words and trying to do so to make sure that we have the right word. And just to give you an example, there is a discourse in what is now chapter 4 in the text, which didn't make it out of her notebooks at all. It's not in the text. And it's a fairly lengthy, really rich discourse. And it starts out by saying it's an answer to Helen's reactions to, and then that final word is unclear. It's just a few letters, it's an abbreviation. And we've seen other transcriptions that haven't managed to transcribe that word. And now you don't know what the beginning paragraphs of the discourse are about. And so what we did was solve the word by realizing, A, it fits other instances of her handwriting when she's written an abbreviation for meditation.
Right, the word meditation.
It maps perfectly onto them. Furthermore, the meditations referred to in the paragraphs before this and meditation is referred to in this discourse. Helen's problems in meditation are referred to, and this question is basically about her fear reaction to meditation. So both the context and other instances of her handwriting make clear that this is an answer to her reactions to meditation. And with that one word solved, the discourse itself now opens up and becomes clear.
And that's now in the new version?
And that's in our version. Yes.
Great, okay. And that's one of a number of instances?
We had a lot of solving like that to do of unclear words. I mean, not thousands of them, but one unclear word can make a sentence, rather unclear, and in some cases make, a paragraph or more unclear.
You have also talked, I think, about Helen's strikeouts. What's all that about?
Well, she would sometimes do multiple versions, or at least two versions, of a certain sentence in her notebook. So she would cross out or strike through something she'd written and then write something else in its place. And we've really paid attention to that in our editing, because oftentimes what would happen is the material she struck through, as if to say this is not what the voice wanted to say, she would then restore when she dictated to Bill for the ear text. And that assumes that the strike through was the error, and that the first thing she wrote down was what the voice was wanting to have her write down. And that happens a lot. And so we've tried to read beneath all her strike throughs, if possible, to see what she wrote down first, because oftentimes that's the preferred wording. But there were a lot of needs for the editing. The early chapters were not that, they jumped around a lot, they were not super organized. Later on, the course comes out quite organized. There's discrete, well-structured paragraphs, there are discourses that are topical, and then those end and a new discourse starts on a different topic, and it's all very organized. For the first several chapters, it really wasn't that way.
Right.
There were also what the voice, which says it's Jesus, and I believe it is, called scribal errors, where she had written something down that's not what he said, and he later corrected. But some of those scribal errors presumably weren't later corrected. So you have to discern if something said in the early chapters, if it flatly contradicts the course's later teaching, you have to assume that that was a scribal error. And there are grammatical errors. There's lots of things that made for the need for editing. The punctuation is not, it's not perfect punctuation. I think a lot of that was Helen. The capitalization is inconsistent. The paragraphing, especially early on, is not particularly good. So oftentimes in the early part of the notes, it's, one sentence is a paragraph.
Right.
There needs to be section divisions, section titles, chapter titles. There's a lot of need for editing, and our whole guiding principle was maximum inclusion and a minimum of change.
Okay, so you weren't seeing this as an opportunity to impose a Circle of Atonement interpretation. You were really
Absolutely not. No, our goal is to preserve the original wording, and if there were changes to make, if they were needed, to make as few wording changes as possible, and in those changes to do our utmost to preserve the apparently intended meaning in that passage, regardless of where that meaning fell.
Have you documented your changes?
That was a very important part of the project. Yes, so we, for the first 4 chapters, we have a 2-column format in which we show the original dictation, and then we show our version, and all the changes can be seen. Differences in wording are highlighted. After that, we just list all changes in wording, oftentimes the reason for those changes, as well as changes in paragraphing and changes in end of sentence punctuation.
Okay, so anybody who feels the need to can go and check everything you've done.
Yeah, and unfortunately, those editing notes will not be within the covers of the book because they end up being 500 pages. Right. And it would just make the book too fat.
And it's a big book already.
Yeah, it's a big book already. So they'll be online for free for anybody who wants to consult them.
So Robert, what are the benefits for the student of A Course in Miracles, the reader? What are the benefits of your new edition?
The benefits of the new edition, I think, are many. This is not to say that the familiar book we've all had is somehow, wrong or deficient. The basic teaching's the same, but what I think will benefit students is having more teaching, and especially having the bridge that Helen and Bill were given. When you encounter new ideas, you want to have those ideas, you want them made clear by examples, by illustrations. You want to see them applied in real life. You want them compared to existing ideas, all for the sake of you actually taking in the new ideas, the unfamiliar. And all of that was there originally for Helen and Bill in the early chapters. And that's specifically what was taken out.
Right.
So that bridge that makes it so clear what he's saying is what we've restored. I think also without the editing that was done, you just get a longer discussion of the same ideas. So it's clearer. The same thing's explained over, using more sentences. And therefore you can track the thought more easily, so it's clear. So we've had readers tell us, and we've had a lot of people giving feedback over the course of the project, and they've been telling us that, it flows more smoothly. It's an easier, more understandable reading experience. And so that's, I think, a big benefit. So the original wording, the extra material, also we've incorporated some other features that we put there to benefit the reader. One is we've heavily footnoted the book all the way through. And the footnotes are there for a number of reasons. One is to try to explain our best understanding of certain passages that are almost impenetrable.
Right.
To the point where you wonder if you have to just remove them because they would just befuddle the reader unless there was some kind of explanation. And so we've tried to explain confusing passages. We've also referenced where the Course says, when I said this before, or remember this. We've referenced, where that is and what that wording is, that earlier reference. Or there's a lot of Bible references in there, both overt, when the Bible says this, and just subtle passing allusions to the Bible. We put all those in there. There's a lot of confusing pronouns in the Course. You wonder what this it or this he refers to. We've put our understanding of what those refer to. And so the footnotes are really there to aid the reader in traversing some pretty difficult material. And in some cases, material that probably was removed by the original editors because it was so impenetrable. So there's the footnotes.
Right.
And then also we have in Appendix 1 what we call the cameos or cameo essays.
I love the cameos.
That's been one of the favorite features for our readers. So what we've had to do with certain blocks of material that Helen took down is take it out of the Course, just like Helen and Bill did, because it really is personal to their lives. There's not enough abstract teaching in there to preserve it. And so at the same time, this personal material is so clarifying in terms of how the Course actually applies to our lives, how it looks being lived out.
Yeah.
And so what we've done is remove that, make those blocks the feature of the cameos. We have 33 cameo essays. And then supply commentary trying to draw out what that material implies and what it's really saying. Because oftentimes its meaning would have been known to Helen and Bill a lot more readily than it would be known to us being this far removed from their lives.
Yeah. You've talked about the benefits for the general reader, but I'm wondering, what have you personally gained from the experience of doing the work and living with the new version? What new insights has it given you, if any?
Unexpectedly, it's actually been a tremendous boon for me in terms of my own understanding and my own work with the Course. I didn't realize it would turn out to be that. But the reason is essentially what I was saying before about the idea of a bridge. Having that bridge of the analogies, the illustrations, the real life examples, personal instruction from Jesus to Helen and Bill, the ideas being compared to Freudian thought or Jungian thought, or the teachings of Edgar Cayce. All of those, because those are all knowns, now you're almost unable to misunderstand what he's trying to get across. I think also for me, how the Course looks lived out in real life, I've really benefited in that understanding. So there's a tremendous focus, for instance, on being on top of your thoughts all throughout the day, not permitting ego-based thoughts to go unchallenged. Tremendous focus on asking within for guidance about little decisions all throughout the day. Huge focus throughout these early chapters. And I think perhaps the single most significant thing for me is the understanding of the miracle. Now, obviously, that is the core topic in A Course in Miracles. It's a course in miracles. Yeah. It's there to teach you miracles, but what are miracles? Course students, by and large, have understood that the Course has redefined the word miracle, but unfortunately, the main redefinition of it has been almost completely lost. Because what happened was this: the early chapters, 1 through 4, but especially 1 and 2, they were originally way longer than they are in the familiar FIP edition. And they're almost entirely devoted to the miracle. What is the miracle? And because of the length at which it's treated, because of all that bridging material, the examples and so on, it's impossible to escape the meaning of it. But oddly enough, almost any course student would tell you that a miracle is a shift in perception. It's an internal shift. And yet what this early material makes clear is that while that is one of the redefinitions of the miracle, the main meaning of miracle in the Course is an expression of love. It's one person expressing love to another and thereby shifting the other person's perception. So the main meaning of miracle in the Course is something interpersonal. It's something largely behavioral. And the idea is that the miracle giver should have some kind of healed perception behind that expression. You need to have love to express love, but still the point of it is to have a healing effect on the recipient, on the other person. And that understanding of miracle changes fundamentally what A Course in Miracles is. And in addition to that basic idea, there's tons of instruction about miracles, about holding yourself ready so you'll be ready when the opportunity arises, about asking for guidance about which ones to give, about watching for what he calls miracle impulses to arise in you, the impulse to give a miracle to somebody else, about the role of the miracle giver, about the role of the receiver. There's just a huge amount of information about this central topic. And it remains the Course's central topic. It doesn't just pass away. It remains throughout the Course. But the real clarity of what he means by miracle is there at the beginning. And because of the editing, unfortunately, that main meaning of what the book is about has been lost.
Robert, we're having this conversation before the new Circle edition of A Course in Miracles goes to print, so I'm going to have to ask you to reach for your notes for this one. But can you give us some examples of material that was in Helen's original notes and that appears in the new Circle edition of A Course in Miracles but has never appeared in any previous editions?
Absolutely. And there is some beautiful material, so I'll give you some examples. I have forgiven you, and that means all hurt and hate you have ever expressed is canceled. Your abilities will be very useful when they come under involuntary control rather than involuntary lack of control. Miracles are a way of undoing overlearned patterns of love lack. Scarcity leads to overeating and other false drives. Abundance eliminates these. I have knelt at your altar as readily as I would ever have you kneel at mine.
Wow. As an experienced student and reader of A Course in Miracles, it's quite amazing for me to hear stuff that I've never encountered before. And from what you're saying, there's lots more of this new, fresh material in the course.
Oh yeah, lots more.
Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to reading it, as I'm sure are hundreds, if not thousands, of other people. And all I can say, Robert, is thank you for the incredible work of scholarship that you and your colleagues have done over many years to make it possible for people like me to encounter this new, fresh material for the very first time. Thank you. Robert, from everything you say, it's abundantly clear to me that this has been an enormous work of scholarship over the last 10 or 12 years. It wasn't all you. Who else was involved?
I've had quite a few people involved, actually. Greg Mackey, who's a teacher for Course in Miracles and for the Circle of Atonement, and a real course scholar. He's been the assistant editor, so he's had a huge role to play in the project. We've had 4 transcribers of Helen's notes, 2 main transcribers really, put in a massive amount of time. We've had, I believe, 14 people checking the transcription at one level or another. And we've had altogether over 40 people involved. Most of them probably just involved in giving feedback, both on the material we've produced and on particular issues we've put before them. And that feedback has actually really helped shape the project, not just with particular things commented on, but just the whole project in many ways. So it's been great to have all these people working towards the same goal of producing a version of the Course that is as close as possible to the original dictation.
Robert, just so I and everybody else can be clear, you're not in any way, shape or form trashing the FIP version of A Course in Miracles, are you?
No, that's been the course that I've both used and taught from right up until, I mean, I'll make the formal switch, the day that our book is actually in print. It's what I've been teaching from all along. I think that we need a balanced view here, because on the one hand, the original editors, Helen and Bill and Ken, were extremely careful to be faithful. They wanted to preserve the meaning that was conveyed. They wanted to stay true to the Course's teaching. They didn't invent material. They just edited material that Helen had received. And for that reason, I've always felt the FIP edition was an excellent version of the Course and is faithful to the teaching.
There are bound to be some people who say, the FIP version is great. It serves us well. We don't need another version. What would you say to them?
Well, I think it's perfectly fine to keep using that version. The version that allows you best to internalize the teachings is the version you should use.
That's so important. Can you just say it for me again so I absolutely understand this, because it's a huge point. A miracle is?
A miracle is primarily an expression of love, an interpersonal act. Secondarily, a miracle is something that shifts our internal perception.
Right. And so that central emphasis on a miracle as an interpersonal act tells me that primarily front and center A Course in Miracles is almost an instruction manual on how to behave in relationship to other human beings.
You're absolutely right, and that's huge, because Course students have by and large assumed it's all about the mind, it's not about behavior.
Absolutely.
And yet if you look at this early material, for instance, one thing that was very influential for me is that I went through and found 14 examples of where the author had called something, a specific thing in Helen and Bill's lives, a miracle. And all 14 examples are exactly this. They're expressions of love from one person to another. And they're very ordinary things. I had kind of assumed that the miracle needed to be something almost biblical in dimensions.
Yeah.
And yet they're really ordinary things. Things that were said from one person to another. Little acts that were done. Things that we may not really notice, but yet still register on the recipient on an emotional level and may be quite significant for that person. So he talks, for instance, about the importance of courtesy. He talks about, I think the quote is, consistent courtesy even in very little things, little interactions. And that kind of picture in which the Course is about, preparing our minds so that we can express love to others, even in very little things, in small acts of courtesy, to have a healing effect on them, that is a dramatically different picture of what the book's about.